Take a quick look at your hand. The color you see, whether it's very light, very dark, or somewhere in between, is the result of an extraordinary journey that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. Your skin tone wasn't chosen by chance. It emerged through an ongoing conversation between human biology and the relentless power of the sun. That story stretches across continents and generations. It involves vitamin D, folate, ultraviolet radiation, ancient migrations, changing climates, and even the unexpected consequences of farming. One distant star, sitting millions of miles away, quietly shaped one of the most visible features of every person alive today. When we trace humanity back to its earliest origins, an incredible fact appears. Every modern human shares ancestors who lived in Africa, and those early Homo sapiens all had dark skin. There were no naturally light-skinned populations at the beginning of our species. The diversity we see today developed much later through the slow work of evolution, adapting to different environments. It's remarkable to remember that every civilization, every culture, and every family tree ultimately connects to that same ancestral beginning. Beneath all our visible differences lies a shared story that reminds us how closely connected humanity truly is. Comment 1. If knowing that every human family shares the same ancient roots changes the way you think about our differences. Before understanding why skin color changed, it's worth appreciating what skin actually does. Many people think of it as little more than the body's outer covering, but it's far more impressive than that. Skin is the largest organ in the human body, constantly performing dozens of vital tasks without asking for any attention. One of its most important responsibilities is defending us from ultraviolet radiation. Every sunlight sends invisible UV rays toward Earth. These rays can damage DNA, break apart important molecules, and create mutations that may eventually lead to diseases such as melanoma, one of the most dangerous forms of skin cancer. The pigment responsible for skin color is called melanin. Think of melanin as nature's built-in sunscreen. The more melanin your skin produces, the darker it appears, and the better it can absorb and scatter harmful ultraviolet radiation before it reaches the cells where your genetic material is stored. Dark skin is much more than a physical characteristic. It represents an elegant biological defense system refined over countless generations. Evolution rarely rewards appearance alone. It rewards whatever improves the chances of surviving long enough to pass life on to the next generation. In equatorial Africa, where our species first evolved beneath some of the strongest UV radiation on Earth, individuals with higher levels of melanin enjoyed a significant advantage. Their DNA received greater protection, harmful mutations accumulated more slowly, and their chances of living long enough to have healthy children increased. Nature doesn't make decisions based on beauty or fashion. It simply preserves traits that improve survival. That quiet process has been shaping life for billions of years, one generation after another. The story becomes even more fascinating because ultraviolet radiation threatens something besides DNA. It also destroys an essential nutrient called folate, a form of vitamin B9 that plays a critical role throughout the body. Folate is especially important during the earliest stages of pregnancy. In the first weeks of an embryo's development, it helps form the neural tube, the structure that later develops into the brain and spinal cord. If folate levels become too low during this brief window, severe developmental problems or pregnancy loss can occur. Here's where sunlight enters the picture again. Intense UV exposure can break down folate circulating in the bloodstream. In environments with constant sunlight, individuals with less melanin experienced greater folate loss because more ultraviolet radiation penetrated their skin. For pregnant women, that created a serious reproductive disadvantage. Lower folate levels increased the likelihood of complications that reduced the chances of healthy offspring. Over many generations, this became another powerful evolutionary force, favoring darker skin. Now, there were two major reasons for melanin to thrive under the African sun. It helped shield DNA from ultraviolet damage, while also protecting folate during pregnancy. One adaptation solved two life-threatening challenges at the same time. Sometimes the most successful solutions in nature are surprisingly simple. A single trait can quietly protect multiple systems, showing just how interconnected biology really is. If this makes you appreciate how many invisible processes keep us alive every day, comment 2. Considering all these advantages, it seems reasonable to ask why skin color ever changed. If dark skin worked so well, why didn't every human population remain the same? The answer lies in one of evolution's greatest trade-offs. Between roughly 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, groups of modern humans gradually expanded beyond Africa. There wasn't one dramatic migration. Instead, each generation settled slightly farther from home than the one before. Over thousands of years, people spread through the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas. As humans moved farther from the equator, the environment transformed. Sunlight struck the Earth at lower angles, passed through more atmosphere, and delivered much less ultraviolet radiation. Winters became longer, skies grew cloudier, and opportunities to absorb UV light decreased dramatically. The challenge was no longer surviving excessive sunlight. Instead, people faced the opposite problem: not receiving enough of it. This introduced an entirely different biological necessity. Vitamin D is produced when UVB rays interact with compounds inside the skin. In a sense, human skin functions like a living solar collector, using sunlight to manufacture one of the body's most essential nutrients. Vitamin D allows the body to absorb calcium and phosphorus effectively. Without sufficient amounts, bones cannot develop or maintain their strength properly. Children may develop rickets, causing soft and misshapen bones, while adults can experience weakened skeletons. And, in women, more dangerous childbirth because of pelvic deformities. Its influence extends even further. Vitamin D contributes to healthy muscles, supports immune defenses, and plays roles in many systems that keep the body functioning normally. Imagine someone with heavily pigmented skin living in Northern Europe tens of thousands of years ago. Their melanin still blocked ultraviolet radiation extremely well, but now that same protection limited the amount of UV available to produce vitamin D. In Africa, this shield had been a tremendous advantage. In regions with weak sunlight, however, it became an obstacle. Over generations, people who happened to inherit mutations that produced slightly less melanin synthesized vitamin D more efficiently. They tended to enjoy stronger bones, healthier pregnancies, and greater reproductive success. Evolution did not suddenly decide that lighter skin was preferable. It simply responded to a completely different environment. Under lower UV conditions, a different balance became more beneficial. Little by little, generation after generation, populations living in northern latitudes became lighter because those changes improved survival under the local conditions. The remarkable lesson is that evolution doesn't create perfect solutions. It creates solutions that fit a particular place and time. What offers protection in one environment may become a disadvantage in another. For many years, scientists believed that Europeans gradually developed lighter skin through an incredibly slow process that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. Ancient DNA has completely changed that picture. Some of the earliest hunter-gatherers who settled across Europe remained relatively dark-skinned for an astonishingly long time after leaving Africa. Living in northern climates alone wasn't enough to rapidly transform skin pigmentation. One of the most famous examples is a man known as Cheddarman, who lived in Britain around 10,000 years ago. Genetic analysis suggests he most likely had dark to medium dark skin, dark curly hair, and striking blue eyes. Today, many people automatically associate blue eyes with very pale skin, but that combination didn't exist in the same way back then. The fair complexions commonly linked with northwestern Europe today became widespread only within the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. Considering that Homo sapiens have existed for roughly 300,000 years, that's an incredibly recent chapter in our story. Human history often feels ancient, yet many of the characteristics we think of as timeless appeared surprisingly late. Evolution continues writing new chapters long after civilizations begin. So what suddenly accelerated this transformation? The answer arrived with one of humanity's greatest revolutions: agriculture. When people abandoned hunting and gathering in favor of farming, their diet changed dramatically. Hunter-gatherers regularly consumed foods naturally rich in vitamin D, including fatty fish, shellfish, liver, and other animal products. Early farmers relied much more heavily on grains such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye. While these crops supplied energy, they contained very little vitamin D. Overnight, entire populations became far more dependent on the small amount of vitamin D their own skin could produce from sunlight. In northern regions where ultraviolet radiation was already scarce, that created a serious challenge. Individuals with slightly lighter skin absorbed enough UVB to manufacture vitamin D more efficiently, giving them healthier bones, stronger immune systems, and better reproductive success. Even tiny differences became important. A modest increase in vitamin D production could improve survival enough for those genes to become more common with every generation. There's another reason farming sped everything up. Hunter-gatherers lived in small, scattered groups. Beneficial genetic changes spread slowly because populations remained isolated. Farming changed that completely. Villages became larger, people settled permanently, and neighboring communities interacted more frequently. Once an advantageous mutation appeared, it could move through thousands of descendants far faster than ever before. Together, reduced dietary vitamin D and larger interconnected populations dramatically accelerated the spread of lighter skin throughout Europe. What had once been a slow evolutionary trend suddenly gained momentum that scientists can now observe clearly through ancient DNA. Small changes can reshape history when the conditions are right. Evolution rarely works through giant leaps. More often, it succeeds through tiny advantages repeated across countless generations until the results become impossible to miss. Comment 0. If you find it amazing that something as ordinary as farming could reshape the appearance of entire continents. One of the biggest misconceptions about skin color is that it's controlled by a single gene. Reality is much more complex. Skin pigmentation depends on dozens of genes working together. Some influence how much melanin the body produces. Others determine which type of melanin is created, how pigment is packaged inside cells, and how the skin responds to sunlight throughout life. That complexity leads to one of evolution's most fascinating discoveries. Europeans and East Asians both evolved lighter skin after their ancestors moved into regions with lower ultraviolet radiation. However, they largely reached that outcome through different genetic mutations. In other words, separate populations found different biological pathways to solve the same environmental challenge. Biologists call this convergent evolution. Similar conditions produced similar adaptations, even though the underlying genetic changes were not identical. Whenever evolution independently arrives at the same solution multiple times, it usually means the environmental pressure was exceptionally powerful. Nature doesn't repeatedly invent the same answer unless that answer truly improves survival. Life is remarkably creative. It often solves identical problems using completely different tools, reminding us that there is rarely only one successful path forward. Since we're already exploring genetics, here's another surprising fact. Every living person with naturally blue eyes traces that feature back to a single ancient mutation. Thousands of years ago, somewhere near the Black Sea, one individual experienced a genetic change that reduced melanin production, specifically in the iris. Before that mutation appeared, every human being most likely had brown eyes. Over time, the new trait spread through later generations, probably because it traveled alongside other genes that were already becoming more common as lighter skin evolved in northern populations. Think about how extraordinary that is. Blue eyes feel like an ancient part of humanity, yet they are younger than agriculture itself. They're younger than Stonehenge. They're younger than horse domestication. Many traits we consider permanent are actually recent additions to the human story. Evolution isn't something that happened only in the distant past. It's an ongoing process that continues shaping our species even today. Now step back and look at the entire picture. Skin color has influenced cultures, politics, and societies for thousands of years. It has been used to divide people, justify inequality, and create artificial boundaries. Yet biologically, skin pigmentation is simply an elegant system for balancing sunlight. It's your ancestors' long-term adaptation to the amount of ultraviolet radiation in the places where they lived, the foods they ate, and the environmental challenges they faced. Light skin isn't universally superior. Near the equator, stronger UV exposure increases DNA damage, raises skin cancer risk, and destroys more folate. In those environments, lighter skin can become a disadvantage. Dark skin isn't less advanced or more primitive. It represents the original condition of our species. Every lighter skin tone evolved later as a specialized adaptation to different climates. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the very same sun drove these opposite outcomes. In regions flooded with intense UV radiation, more melanin protected life. In places where sunlight was scarce, less melanin helped produce enough vitamin D to survive. The sun never chose favorites. It simply shined the same way it always has, while evolution adjusted humanity to match each environment. Comment 3. If this changes the way you think about human diversity, even today, evolution hasn't stopped. Modern life has changed many of the pressures our ancestors faced. We use sunscreen, take vitamin D supplements, eat fortified foods, travel across continents in hours, and spend much of our time indoors. Those innovations have weakened some of the environmental forces that once shaped skin color so dramatically. The evolutionary process continues, but humanity has altered many of the variables influencing it. No one can predict exactly what our species will look like another 100,000 years from now. What we do know is this: every shade of human skin alive today tells the story of the same ancient family that first stood beneath the African sun. Every variation carries a record of migrations, climates, diets, and countless generations adapting to new worlds. Our skin is not a measure of worth. It is a living archive written by evolution, preserving the history of where our ancestors traveled and how they survived. In the end, every skin tone is simply humanity's answer to the same timeless question asked by the sun: